My name is Dan Maines. I'm an anthropologist here at the University of Oklahoma. So it's really exciting just to have all you folks here with us here in Norman and I just arrived at the meetings, but just get to know everybody and welcome to campus. But I'm going to talk about my research in urban Ethiopia. I've been working in urban Ethiopia for a little more than 20 years at this point. My earlier projects were on urban youth and unemployment. More recently, a book on the politics of urban infrastructure. The project I'm going to talk about today is a new collaborative project. So I'm working on this project with a PhD candidate, Robo Mulat, who's at Gondar University in northern Ethiopia. And what we're examining is an industrial park in the city of Awassa. So Awassa's, if you have the map of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa kind of in the center. Awassa is directly south of Addis Ababa by about 150 miles. It's on a good road, and that's where a industrial park was constructed in 2016. And Robo happened to live, he was doing his master's in anthropology at Awassa University, was living in the same neighborhood where a lot of the workers at the industrial park were, so he was able to develop a number of relationships with them. I made a few short visits to do interviews with him, but he's done much more of the research on this project, traveling to the homes of some of the workers at the industrial park. So Ethiopia, as you might know, just in the 21st century, the economy there has been booming. Between 2007 and 2017, one of the fastest growing economies in the world with a growth rate of close to 10%. That's gone down a little bit for reasons of COVID, also civil war there, they'll talk about briefly at the end. But Ethiopia really defines itself as a developmentalist state. And the kind of state discourse takes a really activist approach to maintaining economic growth. And so Robo did interviews with government leaders about the industrial park when it was first opened in 2016, and their statements were a lot of things about transformation. The Awassa Industrial Park will transform lives, will transform the city, it will transform the country, and all of this transformation was about kind of a vision of industrialization, sort of that story that we've all heard many times of kind of you start with industrialization, you build manufacturing jobs, export commodities throughout the world, and then that leads to more economic growth after that. And so the case of the Awassa Industrial Park kind of gives us a chance to see what a developmentalist state looks like in practice. And how this kind of vision of transformation plays out kind of on the ground. And so what I'm going to argue today, and so this is based on the preliminary research we've done so far, this is one of our major conclusions, although it's really an ongoing project. As I said, Robo's working on this for his PhD, he's just starting his PhD research now, but is that the Ethiopian state, the development state, is primarily interested in the production of cheap labor. And the state prioritizes an abstract vision of economic transformation over the well-being of the young women who work in the industrial park in ways that undermine the sort of transformation that the state seeks to enact. So the industrial park itself, it's actually the largest in all of sub-Saharan Africa, consists of 56 different hangars. Each one can house a factory. It was built by a Chinese construction firm, finished up in 2016. Cost about $250 million to build. Initially, there were around 20 different international textile companies that were based there. So these are textile companies primarily based in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, but then they work for international brands, Levi's, H&M. PVH was one of the biggest companies in the park. They manufacture for Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. They recently left the park. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's a capacity for 60,000 workers at this park, and at the time it was built, the population of the city of Awassa was about 250,000, so it's potentially a major increase in the population of the city. It grew from 13,000 workers at the first year to 25,000, then peaked at around 35,000, and then has decreased more recently. I'll get into that near the end of the presentation. And about 90% of these workers are young women, almost all of them who have migrated from the countryside and small towns to work in the factories. So the city of Awassa during this time period is also booming. I did research for my most recent book there, 2013, 2014, all about infrastructure, and the population of the city has nearly doubled over a 10-year period. At the same time, rents, real estate prices, increasing dramatically as well. And so these kind of respective booms, the economic boom based on industrialization and the real estate boom, kind of threaten each other because it becomes very difficult to maintain such a low cost of labor when you have massive increases in the rents for rental properties. So all these international companies that are coming to the industrial park in Awassa are there for a number of reasons, but really it comes down to profits and the different incentives that the Ethiopian state provides. So there's no income tax paid for the first 5 years for international companies. There's no taxes on the import of capital goods and construction supplies. But really cheap labor is really the big thing. The laborers, these young women who work at the factories, are paid a little less than $1 a day. The government flyers that are sent out, so the Ethiopian government does a lot of the marketing, trying to attract international companies to the industrial park, and this cheap labor is highlighted in this marketing that they do. So they compare the cost of labor in China and Bangladesh to Ethiopia. Ethiopian factory workers are paid around a quarter of what a factory worker in Bangladesh would be paid. And it's interesting, a lot of times, textile manufacturing globally, there's been this movement to leave the factory and more into these informal sweatshop manufacturing. And so one of the reasons why textile manufacturing remains in this kind of formalized factory setting in Ethiopia is because the labor is so cheap there. But of course, it's not like it's naturally cheap. The Ethiopian government, this is part of its role as the developmental state, makes a number of interventions to keep that labor cheap. So partially it's just by putting all of those companies together in the industrial park. So the wages at the industrial parks are around 20% less than they would be sort of similar manufacturing elsewhere in the country outside of the industrial park setting. And that's partially because when you have all those companies together, they can coordinate the wages and set it at a relatively low bar. The Ethiopian government has actually prevented trade unions from operating in the industrial park. That actually violates the Ethiopian constitution, but that also keeps wages low. The birr, which is the unit of currency in Ethiopia, was devalued in 2018, and that also makes it attractive for international companies. So these are all things that are done, but a lot of it is really about just the cheap labor and the working conditions there. So the workers there, in contrast, so historically, a lot of the women's labor, women migrating to the city from rural Ethiopia, tended to be women working as domestic laborers, where they would stay with a family, and the family would essentially cover the cost of reproducing their labor in terms of food and lodging. So this is something new, that there's these masses of young women that are moving to the city with the responsibility to kind of cover their own costs, the basic cost of living and reproducing their own labor. So the women are working around 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, as I said, about a little less than $1 a day on average. It's going to be a little bit more than that. And then put that in perspective, so the sort of typical lodgings where most of the young women are staying are near the park, but not in the park itself, would be a very small room, maybe 5 foot by 10 feet, just a concrete room with a door, and then a shared compound by compound, and probably know what I mean, sort of a fenced-in area that's shared with a number of rental properties, as well as maybe a family that owns it. So so you might have 20 people sharing a toilet and a single faucet within that compound. And so around a third of the monthly salary that young women are earning goes towards rent alone. And so young women arrive there with this vision of saving money, helping their families is kind of the classic narrative. And in the end, they end up having to borrow from their families in many cases just to get by. And this is a problem for the state because the government wants to attract international capital to Ethiopia, but because the payment is so low, there's an extremely high rate of turnover at these factories. So the factories are finding that they're replacing workers nearly every 6 months on average. This is just a quote to give a sense of this. This comes from an industrial park worker. She explains that a government representative came to our village and registered all of the girls here who don't have jobs. We were given a simple exam, and after 15 days of training, I was able to start working in the line. I was promised 1,200 birr per month, but the salary was only 650 birr. And in later interviews, when I interviewed government administrators, they admitted that they often would just lie about the salaries in order to attract labor to the city. The cost of food is going up every day. It was very difficult to live. After 3 months together with other workers, I raised some questions about our salary. The company officials told us that if we're not happy, we can resign. And together with 20 other workers, I quit immediately. Of the 65 workers that were hired with me, only around 20 are still working at the park. So in the course of our research, my collaborator, Roble, he followed a group of around 15 workers very closely, multiple interviews, following their lives. And of those 15, after he met them, only 2 were still working at the park a year later. So there's a huge rate of turnover. And so this is a challenge for the government. How do you keep companies happy with the situation, keep their money there with such high turnover, but also knowing that you can't really raise wages because the cheap labor is exactly why these international companies are there. Some of the solutions that the Ethiopian government have enacted are kind of interesting. One of them is to, essentially a lot of the landowners near the industrial park it's not a particularly wealthy part of the town. They don't have a great deal of capital. And so what the local government will do is they'll come in and they'll actually build rental houses on private property, with the stipulation that those can only be rented to industrial park workers and that there is a limit on the rent that can be charged. So it's kind of capped at a certain rate. And then after 5 years, those rental houses will just become owned by the owners of that property. So it's sort of a 5-year period where they would have access to this, which sort of this interesting collaboration between private property owners and the Ethiopian government. From the perspective of the owners, suddenly they've got 12 to 16 young women living in their compounds who are really unfamiliar with the city. They may not speak Amharic, which is the kind of lingua franca of much of urban Ethiopia. And the owners themselves find themselves kind of providing a lot of assistance to the workers, whether it's loaning them tubs to do their laundry, helping them collect water, just guiding them around the town, but in some cases even loaning them money when they're going back to see their parents and that sort of thing. And so there's this interesting process that happens here where both these private residents as well as the Ethiopian state are kind of stepping in to assist with the reproduction of labor in ways that help these international factories. But even still, the cost, even within these rental houses where the price is capped, they're still quite expensive. So more and more young women are going further afield to informal settlements to rent houses that are cheaper. Because these are farther away and because of the late shifts they're working, there's a certain danger in commuting by foot between these neighborhoods. It's also escalated the price of land in informal settlements because of this new group of renters in these kind of semi-rural, peri-urban parts of Ethiopia. And that's, as the price of land has exacerbated, that leads to tensions among the ethnic groups that occupy these areas. It's a very ethnically diverse part of the country. Tensions around ownership of the land has led to some ethnic violence in these areas. More recently, the Ethiopian Investment Commission that runs the park has simply only recruited from neighboring towns, and that way they'll set up a bus service for the workers, sort of a government-provided bus service, which is sort of cheaper and simpler than trying to create housing. And what that does is it means that the women are still able to live with their families. And so instead of sending money home to their families, the families are doing things like cooking their meals, providing laundry, all of the support that they need to continue working at the parks. But even with all of this support, young women are still leaving the factories quite frequently. In many cases, they're going into jobs in the informal economy, whether that's brewing coffee and setting up kind of small coffee shops along the street. Bread baking is also common, hair salons, things like this that provide a little more flexibility and better salaries. And so one of the sort of preliminary conclusions or sort of some of the questions that we're asking based on this is just sort of thinking about, what if the state was interested in economic security more generally, not only for workers at the industrial park? What if working at the industrial park was not a requirement for receiving state subsidized housing? Such a move would imply sort of a different type of developmental state, one that's less invested in a singular linear narrative of transformation through industrialization. This would be a developmental state that recognizes and supports the multiple forms of work and social networks that are connected to economic security, like the women who are working in the informal economy. The Ethiopian developmental state currently creates cheap labor to support economic transformation, but this strategy represents a sort of a singular vision of the future that does not fit the complex realities of the lives of Ethiopian women migrants. And investing in those women, regardless of their connection with the Owassa Industrial Park, would open up possibilities for lives that may or may not involve working in a textile factory. And some of the, I guess, the importance of that much more flexible vision of economic transformation that is not only through industrialization has really been, I think, reinforced recently with the civil war that's occurred in Ethiopia. Hopefully you've heard a bit about this, the civil war between the north and then the main part of the country. Just due to the fighting alone, 50 to 100,000 people have died, many more deaths beyond that due to famine and related causes. So because of humanitarian concerns, the United States has recently so there's this African Growth and Opportunity Act, which provides free access to U.S. markets for manufacturers based in many African countries. And previously, around 70% of the goods produced in Ethiopia's industrial parks were sold in the United States. So the United States has suspended Ethiopia from the African Growth and Opportunity Act because of the humanitarian concerns related to the war. Mali and Guinea, a couple other countries that were recently suspended due to coups in both of those countries. And when that happened, the contracts many of these factories had with the U.S. For exporting goods to the U.S. were canceled. One of the Indian-owned companies immediately cut 3,000 jobs at the factory. PVH closed its operations at the factory, the industrial park, right around this same time. And Robles been able to do a few interviews with workers since then, and they're kind of at a loss to see how that their livelihoods are related to the sort of humanitarian abuses that are going on in the northern part of Ethiopia in relationship to the war. And Robles actually done some writing in popular sort of media outlets in Ethiopia and internationally about this as well. But what it means, I think, for the kind of the discussion that I presented so far is that international politics is blocking the Ethiopian state's attempts to use cheap labor to attract capital. So once again, the young women that are working at the industrial park really pawns in this process, but they're particularly vulnerable because all state support is devoted to reproducing their labor. If there was something like a basic income program or other forms of state support that weren't linked necessarily to working at the industrial park, again, there would not be this kind of vulnerability when those jobs disappear for political reasons. So yeah, kind of a different approach to security, insecurity, but one that I hope that's interesting for you all, and hopefully talk more with you all. Looking forward to learning more about your research. And I guess one last thing is my current project actually is, this is going on as well, but I'm actually also writing a book about the politics of water in Norman, Oklahoma. So also happy to talk about Norman, Oklahoma politics as well as we have more conversations during the day. Thanks.